Last week, Paul made it clear that what he preached was not influenced by the leaders in Jerusalem in any way, even though his opponents probably suggested such a thing. He goes on to say that those leaders in Jerusalem actually agreed with he and Barnabas and Titus. So there was really no way that they could have influenced him in a different direction when they agreed with him. So with that, we're going to go into what I title the Antioch conflict, part 1, because we'll talk about part 2 next week. But so if y'all want to get there with me, we are in Galatians chapter 2, and starting with verse 11, and we're going to do a mere 4 verses tonight.
Oh my God. So we're only going to be here an hour?
If we're lucky. I don't think we'll be. We will be here as long as the discussion continues. What I have to say, it may not be as much, but we will be here as long as the discussion continues. How else? It's the best way to learn anything.
Right.
So, chapter 2, verse 11, we're going to read down to 14. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Those are the ones that came from James. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" We have reached a defining moment in the letter. And it actually, Paul just kind of sneaks up. I mean, he just, wow. There's no leading up to it. There's no, get ready, here it comes. You're just in it. All of a sudden, there is conflict. And he's using it to his advantage with the Galatians. Now, what is inferred with the letter is how he how he just goes into it. Is this something that they would have known about? They quite frankly probably knew about it because the people who started up there in Antioch, probably the same ones that went on up into Galatia to stir it up there. So they probably were very well versed in what went down, but maybe not with the exact details that went down. Okay? But it is quite possible that perhaps the agitators, as we call them, used this to say, you see, Paul was wrong in the Jewish law, but Paul's about to turn that on his head. Of course, the question really is what happened after that last meeting between Paul, James, Peter, and John? What happened to have gotten to this? And we don't even know what led to it. We don't even know why Peter was in Antioch to begin with. We certainly may not necessarily know who the people were that came up from James, but I think it's pretty clear that they're probably the same ones that went up to the Galatia. So, like I said, why Peter was in Antioch is unknown. It was predominantly a Gentile city, but they did have a large Jewish community. If Peter was there to evangelize the Jews, then you can see just how diverse the playing field was. I mean, if Paul was there to evangelize the Gentiles and Peter the Jews, they could very easily go across the same territory. Perhaps Peter was just there on a visit to visit that church. It was actually probably at the time a pretty good sized church. We just don't know. Okay, we have no context here at all of why Peter was there. The Acts account doesn't even talk about Peter being in Antioch, and we'll talk about that as well. What we do know is that from the context that Paul gives us, there were certain people who came up from James. And before they came, Peter had no problem whatsoever with fellowshipping with the Gentile Christians. Now that we know. We also don't know why these certain people came from James, why they came to Antioch, and Paul doesn't tell us. It is obvious that I think the Galatians are familiar with the event. Otherwise, Paul probably would have included many more details about it. If he didn't think that they knew it, he probably would have created more details around the event. But here we go. How about some of the theories of who and why they came to Antioch? Are you ready? Before we actually get into the verses. And these are probably the three top reasons what was going on or why they were there. They were actually the agitators that would eventually go on to Galatia, who were proclaiming in Antioch that what they would proclaim in Galatia. So therefore, they went to Antioch to, hey, you got to do the Jewish law to be saved, and they went on up to Galatia, you got to do the Jewish law to be saved. They were from James as in they were part of the Jerusalem church, but they were acting along. At least that's what the account in Acts says. In Acts chapter 15, the letter that went out from the apostles up to Antioch states that they were not acting under anyone's authorization. That's what that letter said. Option 2, James actually did send them to Antioch to teach the full gospel, which would have been, you have to do the Jewish law. And since they came in James' authority, then everyone, including Peter, complied, because James was over the Jerusalem church. Okay? He was also Jesus' brother. The full gospel being that Gentile Christians would have to observe the Jewish law in order for the Jewish Christians to have anything to do with them. Now this is some other little common things that happens in the Paul letters. The Jewish law always separated the Jews and the Greeks, or the Jews and the Gentiles. And this is another thing that could have happened. Maybe they were not acting on their own. Maybe they were acting from James himself. I'm going to maybe demonstrate some of that a little bit later. Option 3, the certain people of James came because of persecution that was happening on the Christians in Jerusalem. Now we talked a little bit about this with the people that came to the Thessalonian study, that the churches around the Judean area were being persecuted by fellow Jews. Now it's possible that something like that was going on because the Jews at the time were trying to start a rebellion with Rome. They had had enough of Rome, and they were looking for enough people to start a rebellion. In the middle of that, though, what they thought that they really had to do is every Jewish native, who was a Jew, had to come back and practice Torah. Back to completely observing the law. I guess they thought that would be the only way that God would truly be with them, if they would try to become righteous again by doing the law. So some scholars think that these people went out because of the fear of the native Jewish people, and they stirred it up in Antioch with the Jews up there. We got to start doing it because we're going to start this rebellion. Now I think that's the furthest of probably what happened. It's hard for me to imagine 300 miles away how that's going to affect anything down in Jerusalem. But anyway, those are the options. Y'all know that I think it's a combination of 1 and 2. I think it was the same people that came to Antioch that eventually went to Galatia. It's possible that they were acting on their own, but I think I'm going to demonstrate that it's probably not very probable that they were acting on their own because of what was going on in the conflict, okay? But we'll get into that. Let's look at verse 11. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Paul opposed Peter to his face, which means face to face. You know, he didn't do it behind his back. He got right in front of him. And because Peter was doing something wrong. Now, what's interesting is this is the first little section of this part. We don't know how Peter is condemned yet, other than he was. So we have to keep reading to figure out what has Peter done. You know, it hasn't been introduced. It's just whop. Here we are. Peter was condemned. Really? How is Peter condemned? So like I said, there is absolutely no setup. I mean, so when they would have read this out loud in Galatians. So on. Peter was condemned in Antioch. What does that mean? But they probably very well knew about the incident. But they're about to get Paul's side of the story. Verse 12. For before certain men came from James, he, being Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group or to the circumcised. The one point to be noted right away, the certain people were not said to be from Jerusalem. They were not said to be from Judea. They were not even said to be from Israel. They were from James, the leader of the Jerusalem church. Of course, we know that James was first introduced in this letter back in 119 in just kind of an oh-by-the-way fashion. And then later, he becomes one of the apostles that Paul and Barnabas meet with, is James and Peter and John. So that's about the only background that we have in this, at least on this letter, on James. But this is one thing we know for sure. Before these people came up here, Peter acted normally to the Gentile Christians. As soon as these Jewish Christians came up, he completely changed. Before that, he would share a meal with Gentile Christians as Christians should do. When these people got there, these certain people from James, as it is in Greek, what does he do? Eventually, he just immediately backs away from them. He begins to separate himself and not have anything to do with them. Now, that would have been something only a Jew would do. Because the Jews had such an attitude that if they walked across Gentile lands as they were coming back into Israel, they would kick the dust off of their feet to try to get the defiled dirt off before they stepped foot into Israel. That's just the way that they thought. So here, imagine everyone's surprise when you have these Jewish Christians who very well know that the Gentiles have been accepted into the faith, and now they're doing this. And we know from the Acts account that what went on in Galatia, you have to be circumcised and start following after the law of Moses in order to be saved. That's what was going on here as well. But you can imagine the dramatic impact that it had on these Gentile Christians. I mean, think about it. The people, if I could say it this way, that birthed their new faith was now coming up from the mother church and telling them, you can't be saved by just what you're doing. You've got to go back and follow Torah. Otherwise you can't be saved. Which was absolutely contra to what they had been taught by Paul. But they came. And as soon as they came, Peter changed. As stated in the introduction of this passage, there were several theories as to why those people came, but regardless of why they came, the impact was the same. Peter changed his normal Christian routine for a completely different one from the context. The Gentiles, here just make sure we understand, the Gentiles are referring to the Gentile Christians in Antioch, while the ones from the circumcised are the Gentile, or the Jewish Christians from Jerusalem, or from James, as Paul says. Of course, the biggest question is, why was Peter afraid of them? And why did he change as a result of them coming up from Jerusalem? I mean, that's the biggest question. See, Paul doesn't actually just say why. At least we don't think he does. I think he does, but it's not apparent. And why did they have such influence even over Peter? We're going to discuss it at the end of the close. We're going to discuss it when we get done with the next two verses. But y'all think about that before we get there. Verse 13. The other Jews, this would have been the Christian Jews in Antioch, because they would have had Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. So the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy. So that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. The coming of the certain people and the change in Peter had bad effects, obviously, on the Antioch church. Here, the rest of the Jews is referring to those Jewish Christians in Antioch. Paul uses this term to separate the Jewish Christians from the Gentile Christians. That's just how he's doing it here. The Greek verb, soon, and I'm going to say this because you're going to find out why I'm saying it. But here's the verb, and we're going to talk about the noun in a moment. Sunhupakrinomi is the verb that's being used here. Is used to describe what these Jewish Christians are doing. These are the ones that are native to Antioch, okay? The verb means to join in, play in a part, or pretending. We call it hypocrisy today. They were playing into hypocrisy. The following noun that I'm about to talk to you about is also applied to these Jews. It is hypocrites, which we get the word directly, hypocrite. It is a derivative directly from this Greek word. Of course, most of the time, as it is here, it's meant in a negative sense. And it means to create a public impression that is at odds with one's real purposes or motivations. In earlier Attic Greek, this is koine here, modern or everyday Greek. In classical Greek, it meant to be a play actor or a play actor on stage. You were playing something that you really were not. So I guess this is Paul's way of trying to provide a little hope. He's saying Peter and Barnabas and the rest of the Jewish Christians are play acting. This is not what they really believe, but somebody has come up and stirred them up enough that they think that they have to act this way. In our churches today, we look at it from the other direction. People get to church and they put on their church face, where what they really are is something other than church people, right? That's the way we look at it. But what's going on here is the opposite of that. Peter and them know better. They know what the true gospel is. They believe in it. But yet, some influences have come up from that head Jerusalem church. They have turned them on their head. Why? We're talking about Peter. It'd be different if we're talking about somebody else, but we're talking about Peter here. Of course, the big blow comes when Barnabas does the same thing. Now, Barnabas had been with been with Paul for a while. It was Barnabas who actually brought Paul to the apostles in Jerusalem. At that point, it was James, Peter, and John. But it was Barnabas that went down with him and took him. But they knew him. They had never met Paul. And they had been together for a while. Can you imagine what this did to Paul? I mean, I don't think they ever recovered. In Acts chapter 15, 36 through 41, Paul and Barnabas separates. In that account, Luke says it was because of a fellow named John Mark. Paul thought he was just too young, and he had abandoned them on another little trip that they were on. But, one can't help but to think, was this the predecessor of the real separating? Was this something that they could ever get past? We know that they became friends or remained friends even though they were pretty messed up over this situation, because Paul talks about it later. We know that Peter and Paul remained friends because Paul talks about Peter later in a good way. But this went down, nevertheless. In the Acts account, and I've talked about this a little bit, but in the Acts account of chapter 15 that talks about this, Luke doesn't explain everything that went down. In fact, one could say that he left out a great deal in order to make it seem less harsh. In the Acts account, Barnabas joins Paul. And he's arguing with Paul against the people who have come up from Jerusalem. But that's not what happens in Paul's account. Barnabas falls into it. And he starts becoming hypocritical as well. In that Acts account, it doesn't even mention that Peter was there. But yet, we know from Paul's account, Peter was there. We know what Peter did. Maybe some of the things that shed a little light on it is the people who were stirred it up so bad were from the Pharisee side of the Jews. This is where Paul was from as well. And that's probably significant because next week we're gonna see a little bit of Paul's Pharisee background as he continues his talk with Peter. It's not going to stop here. Part 2, he's going to continue to talk to Peter. And I think it's just a little bit of a setup for that. But we will do that next week. The last verse here. Now when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, Peter, in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile, and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? In Greek, how can you force them to be a Jew or live like a Jew? From this context, it would seem that perhaps Paul was not. It could possibly that he was not in Antioch at the time. Maybe he was on a trip back to his homeland, his home city of Tarsus. He gets back, and this is going on. Because if it started going on while he was there, he would have been able to put a stop to it quickly. So it almost feels like maybe he wasn't in Antioch when it started. You kind of get that feel. We can't prove that. We don't know that to be a fact. But that just seems to be that it wasn't something that sneaked up on Paul. He kind of came into the situation and all this was going on. He's like, wait a minute, what's happening? And he finds out pretty quickly. Well, who is the person that he's going to confront the most? The most senior person, in the eyes, I guess, of the people there. Peter, the first one to stand up on the day of Pentecost. By default, Peter's Cephas is Aramaic for rock. So Paul calls him by the nickname that Jesus calls him. And so why not? The person who is at most fault is going to get it. And that's what's going to happen. And that's what does happen. So why Peter? Peter should have been considered prime member. And he was a prime member of the Jerusalem church. For Peter to get carried away with hypocrisy was, like I said before, was devastating for these people. Had to have been devastating. And I'll even say this, after this whole thing went down and the apostles wrote the letter to the believers in Antioch and basically said, y'all do not have to fall after the Jewish law. There was 2 prophets that went up there named Judas and Silas. the Silas that traveled around with Paul after this. And they had to comfort and strengthen that church in Antioch for a while because of this episode. And you can read it in Acts. And I think and I know that some people like the King James. I'm not a big King James person because the King James says here that they exhorted them and confirmed. But what were they were exhorting? These Antioch people didn't do anything other than they existed. So unless they're talking to the Antioch Jewish colony, but no, I've read that part in Greek as well in Acts, and it's pretty obvious to me that they were. The Greek word can mean exhort or comfort, and then they were strengthening them because Paul uses that word in his letters. But it took them a while to get over it, and we're talking about Peter. Of course it did. The conclusion of all of this. Well, Paul has now stated his point. We don't know if he won. Obviously his opponents went on to Galatia and made out that he didn't win. Otherwise, he's laid it out right here what happened, and he will talk a little bit more about what he said to Peter next week. But if one looks, if you back up and look at that Acts account again, the first one after the big debate to stand up was Peter. The very person that Paul reprimanded. He's the first one that has to stand up to try to settle it after it gets down to Jerusalem in front of all of the apostles. So maybe Paul's public reprimand in Antioch pays off, because when it happens down in Jerusalem, Peter is the first one to stand up for Paul in that, and the Antioch Christians. The conclusion again, based on our limited knowledge of actually what happened in Antioch, both here and in the Acts accounts, we are kind of left outside trying to look in at it. We don't have all of the details. Obviously the Galatians knew it, and so he's not providing all of the details around it, but I think we can get enough of it we know pretty much what happened. What is clear is that Paul uses this event to defend himself against his opponents what his opponents have said about him. What is unclear is why Peter did what he did and why he was afraid of the people from James. And what was going on with James in the first place. I'm going to try to provide a possible solution to this. It is quite possible, and I've kind of been setting it up, that Paul has been singling out and setting up James this whole time in this letter. James, Jesus' brother, that very one. There is no doubt that James had become a force in the Jerusalem church. He had become the leader of the Jerusalem church, if by no other reason other than he was the half-brother of Jesus. That in itself has authority, especially when it came to family in the ancient times. There was no doubt that Peter eventually, Peter was the leader of that church, but James has since become that leader. Now that could have been because Peter decided to do more missionary work, or it was just due that James was Jesus' half-brother and it was what it was. But something had to happen, because if James sent these people up and it made Peter afraid, something was really happening. Not just anybody had the ability to come up and make Peter afraid. At least I wouldn't think that they would.
I have a thought on that. You want to finish off?
Yeah, let us get done and we'll talk about it. We'll do that. It is that James was Jesus' brother that probably led to him becoming the the leader in the church of Jerusalem. And the authority that came with that even had an effect on Peter. Peter was probably not necessarily maybe afraid of James, but more than likely he was afraid of his reputation in that Jerusalem church. And of course, it's kind of the cat's out of the bag now. He's been confronted by Paul. So, but he wanted to do whatever, I guess, if some people came up from the Jerusalem church and they said, do thus and thus, it was just a very difficult thing to defy the Lord's brother. You just think about it, that would have been a difficult thing to do. This was the person who grew up with Jesus. But I will state this, James was one of the last people to see Jesus alive, according to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. All the other ones. Now Paul was the very last, but it was the 12 who first saw him. Like I said before, I actually think that Paul has been singling out James the whole time. I'm going to show you why. Now this is just my musings. I don't expect y'all to believe that this is what's going down. This is what, from my studying of this in the Greek language, why I think it is. But it starts in verses 1:1. Paul says that he wasn't sent by men, and he didn't become an apostle through or by a man, a singular man. I just find that interesting that he would say it that way. He wasn't sent from men, plural, and he didn't come to be an apostle by a single man. Why would he use the singular form of anthropos there? I don't know. But was he referring to a certain person when he used that singular form? Down in 1:19, Paul states, I didn't see any other or different apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. Now he uses a little word called heteros. Now he has used this word before already in verses 6 and 7. And we talked about it then. Heteros is another something of a different kind. Allos is something that's another of the same kind. So there he says, I can't believe y'all have turned to a different gospel. Then he uses another gospel of the same kind. But I will also say this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he uses heteros along with allos to separate gifts of the Spirit into categories. So Paul knows what he's doing with the Word. Okay? So James is now another apostle of a different kind, so to speak. Y'all following it? He's not an apostle of the same kind. Brother Torrey over here is looking at me in deep concentration.
Brother Ralph knows that concentration pretty good. Yeah. From time to time.
So the question is, why use that word? Why use heteros, another of a different kind, with referring to James? Could it be that because James was not originally part of the 12, that he's an apostle, but he's different because he was not part of the 12? Or is he different because he believes something other than what the 12 believed? Don't know. The third point. Let me just say this. There are many Greek scholars who believe that Paul is just using the words interchangeably. But I don't believe he's doing so in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 when he's using it. I'm not sure he's using it to be the same here either. At point 3, in chapter 2 verse 9, Paul places James first in line with the apostles he mentions. James, Peter, John. Now, I will say this again. Word order in the Greek language is significant. Now, there is no doubt James was the leader of the Jerusalem church at the time. So, first and foremost is probably why James is first. But it also could mean that James is at the first of the line because James is being singled out. Bringing attention to James. He's the first one up. Why? I think it leads right on in to this chapter 2, verse 12. And there's a lot of the final point. They came from James. They didn't come from Jerusalem. They didn't come from the Jerusalem church. They didn't come from Judea. They came from James, which means James sent them. Or at least that's what Paul thinks. James sent them. Why would you say it in such a way if it were not true? I think he's singling him out. I think that he thinks that James is the culprit behind this whole affair. The people that came up from Jerusalem that told these people, you have to start obeying Torah or you cannot be saved. I think James is I think Paul thinks James did it. I'm not the only one that holds this view. There are many scholars who don't hold the view. But quite frankly, sometimes I just think that some scholars just fail to see what might be going on because they want it to be an easy going. But the reality is conflicts happened in the New Testament. People didn't believe what other people believed in the New Testament. It's obvious all the time. For me, it makes it more real. These people were as human as we are.
Sure.
And when you can see that was going on, they're not these angelic beings that we are to just look upon and glorify in. These people were real. They had problems like we do. They had more problems than we do. So for me, I don't let that kind of stuff bother me. So what if James did it? James was as human as the next man. He got it wrong. He turns around and gets it right. I'm going to leave you with Peter's words in Acts 15. So the Antioch account has happened, and the Antioch church has sent Paul and Barnabas and some others down to talk to the apostles in Jerusalem to try to settle the matter. Here's Peter. And this is Acts 15, starts with verse 6. And the apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that He accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them, just as He did to us. He did not discriminate between us and them, for He purified their hearts by faith. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the Gentiles a yoke? Y'all get this. A yoke that neither we nor our ancestors could have been able to bear. They couldn't do the Jewish law either, you see. No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ that we are saved, just as they are. Now that sounds like Paul, doesn't it? That sounds like something he would say. But yet, here's Peter redeeming himself from his little...
And that was after all of the...
Yeah, and they went down to Jerusalem to try to settle the matter.
And after this, where Peter was...
and right after this, James stands up. And, it's basically over at that point. And James makes sure that a letter is drafted to the church in Antioch that you do not have to obey Torah, the Jewish law. But Paul's, Peter's stuff here sounds like Paul.
Yeah.
We couldn't bear it ourselves. Why would we possibly try to get these Gentiles to bear it when we couldn't? We'll talk more about this next week.